Hello everyone, Nick here again for What Game Now. Today we are going to talk about theme forces. What are they? Why would you use them? How can you use them? And this video is also going to serve as a primer going forward because we're going to do a video on each theme force, or at least that's the plan. So this video is going to talk about what kind of things you're going to see in those videos, where we're going to go, and how to interpret those videos. We're going to assume everyone has watched this, so good on you for watching this before watching the theme force videos. So let's go ahead and get through here. I'm going to apologize before we get started. There aren't a lot of pictures suitable to the content, so I just put up some eye candy, some models for you guys to look at. First off, what are we going to talk about in this video? We're going to start with what theme forces are, how they work, what you're going to get out of them, and downsides. So just kind of a brief overview. We're going to talk about how you use a theme force, how you can actually put one in your army or use one when you build an army, how you can read them, how do you understand what do you need to get, what do you get for playing in them, some general tips for building a theme force, and then we're going to go through the overview of the theme force videos. So, what is a theme force? Theme force are an optional list building mechanic unique to Warmachine and Hordes. What they try to do is to enable players to build a list that is both consistent with the fluff, lore, background, whatever you want to call it, while simultaneously being effective and even tournament competitive. This has been done so well to the point where if you actually go to a Warmachine tournament, everybody plays in a theme force, so it looks like the forces you would actually see in the universe fighting. A lot of other miniature games, that's not necessarily true. A list that is consistent with the universe or consistent with the background generally isn't terribly effective on the tabletop. The best example I can give is if you give a player a historical game system and say, come up with the best list you can, it will look nothing like what those forces would have looked like historically. Warmachine addresses this with the theme force mechanic. So, what you're going to get out of a theme force is a small controlled selection of models. The theme force will tell you you may only include these models. You don't get the whole faction. This is nice, especially if you're a newer player, because it limits your buying choices. You do not need to walk in, see the hundreds of models on the shelf, and go, what do I need to get? The theme force tells you that. The theme force has built-in synergies and interactions, so the units are designed to work alongside each other. You might have an ability or a character who references a specific type of unit in his rules. He will be in that appropriate theme force. You don't have to worry about, well, I have a character and I don't have anything his abilities work on. He's just wasted space. The theme forces will help you avoid that. On the tabletop, you're going to get additional rules and models compared to a non-theme force. This is to help offset the disadvantage of having a more limited selection of models. What you're going to get out of playing in a theme force is bonus rules, extra models. Again, they're consistent with the fluff. They are controlled. You can't just pick whatever you want. And that's going to help offset your major weaknesses. And the other advantage, and this may not be obvious based off what I'm describing, is they're actually very flexible in their list construction. There's a lot of choices within a theme force, and Privateer Press has done a good job recently of making sure that theme forces are very open. They actually went through an update in fall of 2019 called the Oblivion Update, where they made sure that theme forces were very flexible. In fact, if you were to build a list of what is, I want to build a list in a vacuum, you could probably just make it a theme force with one, maybe two changes. They're that good. You might build a list without a theme force and say, oh, I want this model and this caster and these units. And then you go start looking over the theme forces and you realize that, well, if I swap this one unit out, I qualify as a theme force. So very flexible construction. There are some downsides. So because of theme forces, it is very hard to play out of theme. So as a new player, if you're going to go out there and just buy a selection of models off the shelf, this does hurt you because the game is designed for people to use theme forces. The models are designed, the rules are designed that way. You do have a more limited choice of models. If you think a model looks really cool, but it's not in your theme force, you almost kind of have to build a new army for it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just a thing to keep in mind. The other major advantage is mercenaries and minions. One of the biggest advantages to a non-theme force is unlimited access to mercenaries and minions. So those are models that are not in your faction but can play for your faction. Theme forces generally very harshly limit these. You can still pick the same ones, just nowhere near the same quantity as you would outside of a theme force. So with that out of the way, let's talk about how to actually use a theme force. So, in order to use a theme force, what do you need to do? You just need to decide that you're using one. This is not a mechanic that requires special permission from your opponent or is only allowed in certain situations. It is by default allowed in any situation you can play Warmachine. Something has to tell you you cannot play a theme force. If nothing says you can't play a theme force, then you may play a theme force. When you build your theme force, there will be a composition section that will list the models you may have in your army. Now, it may use keywords like living or a specific troop type or undead. Those are either determined by rules or by keywords in the name or the keyword line of the model's card. I have an example in a moment, and we'll show that. Now, there used to be some restrictions about, well, a certain percentage of your army needs to be this to get the bonuses. That has since been removed. So if you hear any references to that, that is out of date. And then all other normal list building rules apply. So you still can't, well, okay, you can exceed your point total due to a mechanic at the end, but it doesn't increase your build total or anything like that. If you're playing a 75-point game, you're still playing a 75-point army. You may have 75 points of models on the field. It also does not allow you to ignore the field allowance rules, so you can't take a character multiple times, or you can't take something more times than you would normally be allowed. What you get out of a theme force is two things. First is called requisition. For every 25 points of army build total, you get 1 requisition point. So if you're playing a 25-point game, you get 1. If you're playing a 75-point game, you get 3, and so on and so forth. You don't have to spend every point, but you get it if you could have. You may spend 1 point on any choice from the requisition options list in the theme force. Again, I have a picture in a moment, so hold on. These are additional models to your force, and you do not pay points for them. So this allows you to go over the point total. You are still not allowed to go around the field allowance rules, but this does allow you to field more models than the point total would indicate. Now, in general, the amount of points you're getting for free is around 14 to 16. And they're very limited in what you're allowed to choose. You'll see in a moment. They're generally support models. Models that would normally get cut in a non-themed force because you need the troops and you need the jacks or the war beasts. Now you're allowed to have them. You're not getting extra combat power necessarily. You're not getting free heavy war beast like Azrael here, for example. He's a Legion war beast. You're not going to get him. But they're going to give you some of these support options. And you are allowed to choose the same option multiple times, subject to the field allowance rule. The last thing you're going to get is extra rules. So a section at the end tells you any army-wide additional rules that your force will get. Some of these can be pretty minor. Some of them can be pretty major. Now, if you hear all this and go, well, why would you never play in a theme force? That is a good question. There are some reasons. The first one is that you have a fundamentally limited choice. Units in a theme force all tend to have the same conceptual theme, which means they tend to do very similar things. So, for example, the Signar theme force called Gravediggers, which is going to be the first video in the series, generally is comprised of infantrymen with rifles. Anything heavily armored, they're going to struggle with. The requisition options help you by saying, hey, here's a little more flexibility, or here's that character that you need to get this rule. It doesn't, generally, the requisition options by themselves don't overcome the bonus for being a theme, but the combination of these makes theme forces a very attractive choice. The default way players play Warmachine is in theme. Like I said, if you go see the top winning lists for the Measure event each year at Warmachine, you're going to see a theme force. Apologies. Need to keep the water going. All right, so what does a theme force look like? I have pulled up a theme force here called the Scourge of the Broken Coast. This is a Crix theme force centered around the living aspect of Crix. This is the pirates, the raiders, the reavers, you name it. So at the top we have the name, Scourge of the Broken Coast. Little symbol to the left tells you what faction it's in. And then below that, in bold and italicized, we have a brief description of the theme force. So this is the living pirates of Crix that raid the coastlines and ships. Below that, you will see a black line with army composition. The section below that tells you the things you may only include in your army. So in this case, an army using this theme force can only include the following Crix models. Crix Warcasters, non-character Warjacks, Barathrum and Charybdis, who are both character Warjacks by the way, living Crix model units, the Devil Shadow Mutineers, and Misery Cage Solos. At the bottom, this army may include one mercenary solo and one mercenary unit that will work for Crix. These model units can be included even if they have the Partisan Crix special rule. Mercenary units in this army can include non-ranking officer attachments. So let's break that down real fast. Crix Warcasters. Any Warcaster in Crix is legal to play in this theme force. That is pretty consistent across the entire game. It is very rare to see a theme force that limits your Warcaster selection. There are a handful of them, but in general, any Warcaster is fine. Non-character Warjacks, again, fairly standard line. Most theme forces will allow you to have the non-character Warjacks and Warbeasts. If you can't tell if something's a character, look at the model's field allowance in the bottom right corner of its card. If its field allowance is C, it is a character. So non-character Warjacks include the Slayer, the Reaper, the Stalker, the Kraken. Colossal is an example of a non-character Warjack. Barathrum and Charybdis are two Crix Warjacks that are characters. You can include them in a Scourge of the Broken Coast army, even if they're not with their normal Warcaster. There is one rule in the game that says if a Warcaster and a Warjack or Warbeast has a rule called Bond, they can always be included in any army that allows that caster. In this case, though, Barathrum and Charybdis are allowed in this theme force regardless of the caster. All of the character Warjacks have a home somewhere. Okay, living Crix model units. Living is not a tag, it is not a keyword. Instead, that's rule-based. A living unit is a unit composed entirely of models that are not undead or not a construct. So, for example, the Bane Warriors, are not legal in this theme force. The Mechanothralls are not legal in this theme force. They have their own theme force. The Devil Shadow Mutineers is a named character Crix unit. You can include them. And then Misery Cage Solos. Again, the Misery Cage is a very specific type of solo. Now, I want to say one last thing. The living Crix model / units, that means units that are living Crix, or living in from the Crix faction, or single models, which can include solos. So any living solo is also legal in this theme force by that line. And then the mercenaries, any mercenary who will normally work for Crix can be included in this theme force, but you may only have one mercenary solo and one mercenary unit in total. A non-theme force doesn't have that restriction. Next up, next section down, we have the requisition options. If you play a 25-point army, you will get one requisition option. At 50, you'll get 2. At 75, the standard game size, you'll get 3. You may spend the requisition options on any options, or the requisition points, I should say, for any of the requisition options on this list. You may spend multiple requisition options on the same entry. So if you want the first unit, one Shard Dirgeseer unit, you can do that twice. You can do that 3 times if the field allowance will let you. I don't remember if it does, so don't quote me on that. So requisition options, 1 Shard Dirgeseer unit. That's a specific named unit if you go look in Crix. 1 Crix Command attachment. 3 Misery Cage Solos. And 1 other small or medium-based Crix solo. Now I do want to point out, these do not override the army composition rules. There are undead Crix solos. You may not have them in this theme force because of the requisition system. So this does not let you override any other rules. This is simply bonus models. 3 Misery Cage solos, you're going to get 3 for 1. So if you spend 1 requisition point, you'll get 3 solos. Pretty easy once you read it, but these can be kind of daunting the first time you try and figure out what's going on. So this is how all theme forces look. Pick a theme force in the game. It will have the exact same formatting. It won't have the same options. That's the whole point of theme forces. But they'll look very similar to this. Alright, so now that we know how theme forces work, and we know how to use them, and what we're going to get out of them, let's talk about what we're going to do next. And that is actually start building it. The Statixis Raiders and Sea Witch here are actually a unit available in the theme force on the previous slide. So, general tips when building a theme force. The first thing you need to decide is, are you going to go Warjack Warbeast heavy or not? Notice that the theme forces don't care what you put in them, so long as they're within those restrictions. You can play Scourge of the Broken Coast and never have any additional bonuses. I did forget. I'm totally sorry. Special rules at the bottom. I don't know why I totally skipped this. But it actually addresses this, so it kind of ties in. Crix Warjacks in this army gain Gang Fighter. Up to 1 Statixis Blood Witch unit in this army gains Ambush. Those are just bonus rules that your army gets for playing in the theme force. If you play Warjack heavy and don't have a Statixis Blood Witch unit, the bottom bonus, the bottom special rule, is completely useless to you. If you play with a lot of infantry, the top bonus is of limited use to you. So you don't have to play Warjack heavy, but be wary, might not always be the best idea. Okay. And like it says up here, the reason why is many theme forces are going to give little to no benefit to Warjacks or Warbeasts. Gang Fighter's pretty good. That's a really good bonus. But you still need infantry to trigger it. Gang Fighter is if the Warjack punches somebody who is engaging an enemy, who is engaged by a friendly faction warrior model, not Warjack, not Warbeast, not Battle Engine. It gets +2 attack and damage rolls, which is a pretty significant bonus, but it requires these infantry models to be present. Now, you can get around this a little bit. The solo selection is generally flexible enough to allow you to play a lot of Warjacks. You're still going to want at least 1 unit because of how theme forces work. But on the whole, you have a choice. Do you want to go Warjack heavy or do you not want to go Warjack heavy? Once you've made that decision, you can decide to either build to a theme's defensive strengths or offensive weaknesses. So what will happen is players generally tend to build a theme force one of 2 ways. They're either accentuating their defensive strengths, not their offensive strengths. If you already hit really hard, generally hitting harder isn't that big of a deal. You can do it, but if you're already above average, that's usually good enough. So what players will do is, well, my theme force gives me these defensive bonuses. Well, I'm going to accentuate those. Defense adds up a lot more than offense. The more you can stack defenses, the more you can stack armor. It actually gets exponentially, not quite exponentially, but it gets harder and harder to do damage. More so than just the numbers would imply. A +2 to your defense is a pretty big deal, depending on where you are on the defense stat. Jumping from a defense 10 to 12 isn't that major. Jumping from defense 14 to defense 16, however, is pretty backbreaking. Players will often call this a skew list, where you're trying to do one thing, really well. And in the case of, say, this theme force here, there's a lot of living models. You might try and swarm your opponent. There's not a lot of defensive stuff here if you look at the theme force to really get into, so maybe that's not a best option here. Option number 2 is to help cover your offensive weaknesses. One of the biggest downsides of theme forces is they do one thing, or they do a couple things really well, and they really struggle in the other areas. There's no middle ground. So anything you can do to help bridge that gap is pretty important. So the other alternative when building a list is to build to your offensive weaknesses. This particular theme force up here that we had, the Scourge of the Broken Coast, has decent damage output, but not amazing damage output. So maybe it would be advisable, it'll kill a lot of infantry, by the way, it'll kill lots and lots of infantry, but maybe you want to focus your list build towards damage buffs or debuffs on your opponent, and look to warcasters that'll do that. You know, maybe in this case, you look at a caster who's got Parasite or Curse of Shadows or Scything Touch to help offset a weakness in power. So between this and Jack Heavy, there's actually quite a few choices when you build a theme force and you start messing around with them. Casters are generally completely open. You'll find that players tend to favor casters that do more for the things in the theme force. So if I have a theme force and it's full of a bunch of infantry, you're going to want a very infantry-focused caster. That's not unique to theme forces, but it's just a general note. If you build a Warjack heavy theme force, you want a caster who does a lot for Warjacks. Players do prefer, generally, things that also help what's in the theme force, and you can tell by the requisition options here. So if your requisition options is giving you specific models, players like casters who can take advantage of those models as well. Use as much of the army as possible, including the requisition options. Alright, so with that, what are we going to go to next? So next we're going to do theme force videos. The first one in the pipeline is Gravediggers, which is a Signar theme force, and then I've got Dark Menagerie lined up behind it, which is one of the Grimkin theme forces. You're going to see a distinction between the two because they're very much on polar opposite ends of each other. We're going to try and do one for each faction and then go back. If you have any requests, drop them in the comments and we can see about putting it in the pipeline earlier. When we go to those theme force videos, what we're going to talk about is where they fit in the universe first off. What does this force represent? Where in the universe do these guys fit into the world, or girls fit into the world? So we're going to talk about the background, lore, whatever you want to call it. Then we're going to go through a description of the theme force, what kind of bonuses and requisition does it have, just like we did with the Scourge of the Broken Coast earlier in this video. Then we're going to go through the casters, jacks, beast units, and solos, and we're going to talk about good and bad choices, key interactions, give brief summaries of what's available. I can't necessarily promise to cover everything, but we'll cover the outliers, either good or bad. And then finally, we'll have a section on tips to build that particular theme force. What models to start with, what casters to start with, key interactions to account for and make sure you have present in your army, what mercenary options you want to look at, and where it fits into a larger collection. So hopefully this wasn't too boring. I will see you on the next one.
Hey, this is Dave. If you like what we're doing here at What Game Now, go ahead and click on one of the videos which should be on either side of me, or click right in the middle and go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the bell once you subscribe so that you know when we have new videos. Please go ahead and share us with your friends. Let everybody know that we're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for all of our subscribers already. And we look forward to bringing you more content every chance that we get.